Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you, Tanya, for running this fine panel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this great conference. I think that we're going to have some very interesting talks in these very interesting times for the next 2 days. And a great thank you to Dr. Hugues in particular, who found a way to drag a French Canadian out of his isolated perch in Singapore to talk about European naval power in Kingston, Ontario. Well done, sir. Now, why did I put such emphasis on the Royal Military College of Canada sign on my cover slide is to make it quite clear that I am speaking under my hat as a adjunct assistant professor at RMC. I am not speaking as a defense advisor at the High Commission of Canada. I am here for the next 2 days in the warm embrace of the blanket of sweet, sweet academic freedom, and shall express myself to that effect. So my views should not be confused with those of the Canadian government, the Department of National Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces, the Royal Canadian Navy, and all of these outfits. Now, with all that said, my presentation uses 4 centuries of European naval history to inform a very immediate strategic dilemma facing most naval powers from the old continent today. Where should limited naval resources be deployed? Should European navies deploy in force into the Indo-Pacific, a region vital for global trade and increasingly defined by great power competition? Or must they prioritize the Atlantic theater and the security of the transatlantic order? Works. So my title, Balancing Atlantic Commitments and Indo-Pacific Engagements, speaks to this tension. It is easy to see the Indo-Pacific as the future, but European history suggests that the Atlantic remains the essential foundation in security terms. My central argument is this. The European maritime experience offers enduring lessons on the strategic trade-offs between projecting naval power globally and consolidating security in European waters. History repeatedly shows that Atlantic security is the fundamental prerequisite for successful global engagement for European navies. When that balance fails, power projections become strategic overreach. To demonstrate this, we will trace 5 distinct historical eras, each of which reveals a different facet of this fundamental trade-off. First, we'll look at the Iberian model and its imperial vulnerabilities, the British dualism of Atlantic First, Empire Second, the World Wars and the centrality of the Atlantic, the Cold War that institutionalized the Atlantic priority, and the return of great power competition that we live today, that marked the end of what I call a European naval holiday. Now, let's begin with where the cycle started, the long ago age of global ambition that showed how distance reach can be negated by vulnerabilities closer to home. We begin with Spain and Portugal. These were the first European states to build maritime systems spanning Africa, the Americas, and Asia, reaching out to the Indo-Pacific long before the term existed. But their systems were fragile, overstretched. They were fighting land wars in Europe and managing distant colonies across 3 oceans. And most importantly, they never managed to keep their home waters secured. Their rivals, especially the Dutch and the English, understood this perfectly. They realized that they did not need to defeat Spain in the Philippines or in the Caribbean, or fight Portugal in the Spice Islands. They only needed to cut their Atlantic lifeline. The best example is the Battle of the Downs in 1639. A Spanish fleet carrying silver from the American colonies and troops from Spain sheltered in English waters on its way to the the Spanish Netherlands. They had assumed that England's neutrality would protect them from the Dutch at the time. But the Dutch being the Dutch, they attacked anyway, destroying most of the Spanish fleet just off the coast of Kent. The consequences were global and felt throughout the next decades. Without those ships and that treasure, Spain struggled to defend its trade routes, supply its garrisons, and pay its armies. The empire eventually faltered because its Atlantic flank collapsed. The lesson was clear. Global reach could not compensate for weakness at home. And Britain learned that lesson and built an empire based on the opposite principle. The sun never set on the vast empire, and the Royal Navy controlled choke points around the world: Gibraltar, the Cape, Suez, Singapore, but always on one condition: the home fleet had priority. If the Channel or the North Atlantic were threatened, everything else took a second place. Wherever a peer rival emerged, France in the 18th century, Germany in the 20th century, Britain recalled ships from distant stations to reinforce the Atlantic when the need arose. Global power projection was possible only because near seas control was assured. The pattern reached its clearest expression during the wars against the revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Between 1798 and 1805, London repeatedly pulled ships back from the Mediterranean, the West Indies, or even the Indian Ocean to reinforce the Channel fleet when needed. If Britain lost the Atlantic, the empire would not matter. The concept was formalized into the two-power standard in the late 19th century, which fundamentally ensured overwhelming superiority in European waters before any consideration of imperial defense. Even as the challenge shifted from France to Germany, the doctrine remained constant. The concentration of the Grand Fleet in the North Sea was the absolute, non-negotiable insurance policy for the entire global structure. This drive to reinforce the Atlantic core led to one of the most critical and revealing strategic adjustments of the era: the outsourcing of regional maritime security. By the early 1900s, the Royal Navy needed to consolidate its strength against Germany in the North Sea. However, its fleet was still dispersed around the globe, including a significant presence required to maintain stability in the Far East against Russian expansion. In 1902, Britain signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, a watershed moment in British strategic history. For the first time, Britain explicitly accepted that an ally would take the primary security responsibility for a vast geographic sector, basically the North Pacific out to the Canadian coast and parts of the East Asian littoral. In exchange for Japan's commitment to defend British interests in that region, the Royal Navy could withdraw the majority of its capital ships from the China station. This was a direct, calculated transfer of security responsibility that allowed Britain to redeploy its naval assets back to the Atlantic and the North Sea. Similarly, the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904 resolved several imperial conflicts far afield and decreased the need for high readiness units in several stations overseas. Diplomacy was used as a tool of force management, allowing for strategic concentration in the core by reducing peripheral commitments. The pattern was evident: defend the core, then project to the periphery, never the reverse. The First and the Second World War confirmed this logic on an overwhelming scale, as accurately explained by Evan just now. The strategic pattern that emerged in both conflicts was identical and existential. The ultimate strategic center of gravity for the European allies was always the transatlantic sea lines of communication. The German U-boat campaigns in both wars were designed to cut this vital artery, threatening national collapse and rendering any eventual victory on land impossible. As Churchill put it, the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all through the war. And the German U-boats were the one threat that kept him up at night throughout those years. This history profoundly reinforces my thesis. Global engagement is impossible if the foundational security of the Atlantic is compromised. The survival of the entire European project was contingent upon sea control and sustainment in the near seas, an absolute priority that immediately trumped all other global maritime ambitions for the Europeans. And so, with the creation of NATO in 1949, the Atlantic priority became institutionalized. What Britain had practiced out of instinct, NATO now embedded in its strategy, force design, and command structures. The Cold War architecture essentially defined European naval capacity away from sustained global power projection. For 40 years, European navies had three essential and interconnected maritime tasks constituted for this collective defense priority. First, they needed to consolidate the littoral foundation. European navies, or at least the continental navies, first task was to secure their immediate periphery, focusing on coastal waters, their ports, and local lines of communications. This crucial allocation of labor, minesweeping, littoral patrols, coastal defense, freed up the heavy naval assets such as carrier groups and nuclear-propelled attack submarines of the United States Navy and the Royal Navy for them to focus mostly on blue water missions and the deep ocean Soviet threat. Second job was to protect the conventional bridge, safeguard the Atlantic superhighway. NATO's entire conventional war plan rested on protecting the SLOCs to ensure the safe passage of North American troops and vast quantities of equipment to Europe. Were this lifeline cut, the conventional defense of Europe would collapse. And finally, it was securing the strategic shield. The third major task involved high-end anti-submarine warfare, primarily focused on maintaining sea control across the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. This effort was crucial for shielding our ballistic missile-carrying submarines in transit to the patrol box, as well as preventing the Soviet surface fleet from breaking into the Atlantic, and the Red Fleet SSBNs from closing in on Allied cities and bases on both sides of the Atlantic. The strategic trade-off was resolved by alliance structure. Global maritime responsibilities, the Deep Blue Sea mission, was largely the preserve of the USN and to a lesser degree the Royal Navy, which admittedly greatly frustrated France to no end, as I narrated in more details in my book about the fall and rise of French sea power during those years. But regardless of these tensions, at least until France left the military alliance, or the military organization, history shows that the stability of the transatlantic security order remained the ultimate source of European security and defense posture. Then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russian submarines stopped pushing through the GI-UK gap. The Atlantic suddenly felt quiet. Europe entered a period we might call the illusion of strategic autonomy. For nearly 3 decades, it seemed that Europe downsized its fleets, cut defense budgets, and yet still acted globally, because the home theater no longer appeared threatened. European navies shrank, but their global ambitions grew. They joined UN embargoes in the Adriatic and the Middle East. They conducted coalition operations in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. They took on anti-piracy commitments in the Indian Ocean. They supported humanitarian operations around the world. And increasingly, they deployed to the Indo-Pacific. Because nothing catastrophic happened during those years, European powers began to believe an old idea almost taking us back to the Iberian model in that they could be global maritime actors while running thin at home. The belief would prove temporary. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the first warning. Then the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine was the full shock. Suddenly, the Atlantic mattered again. Russia revived submarine activities, expanded maritime operations in the high north, and began probing undersea structures, whether they be pipelines or data cables, in ways not seen since the Cold War. Europe discovered that its reduced fleets were once again required for home water defense and alliance deterrence posture. The political conversation shifted from where can we deploy to what is our readiness in our home waters. And the answer, after three decades of focusing exclusively on expeditionary roles, was sobering. The capabilities that were divested, ASW ships, fleet tankers, mine warfare vessels, maritime patrol aircrafts, were precisely the ones now desperately needed. The European naval holiday was over. While Indo-Pacific engagement remained a strategic goal, the reality of finite resources forced a painful reprioritization. Every deployment to the Pacific now means a risk calculation against the Atlantic, a risk that was willingly taken 10 years ago, but is now more carefully measured. Whether they can put 1 or 2 carrier strike groups at sea, even the largest European navies, that is the Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy, they have to carefully weigh the cost of losing a critical high-end asset for nearly a year for each Indo-Pacific deployment. When factoring in the long transit times, the actual mission in theater, and the required rest and maintenance period upon return, that decision immediately creates an extended vulnerability window in the Indo-Atlantic theater. This crucial assessment must now be gauged against the renewed high-end threat posed by Russia, making an Indo-Pacific deployment an explicit and temporary reduction in Atlantic security capacity. So where does this leave Europe now, and what does it mean for Canada? Indo-Pacific engagements by European powers remain strategically valuable, and for this Canadian, absolutely welcome. I am not saying Europe must not go to the Indo-Pacific. These deployments are far more than symbolic. They represent concrete contributions to shared security goals. They operationalize the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. European navies are essential for reinforcing maritime norms and strengthening partnerships across the theater. Their presence would provide crucial mass were they to accept participating in high-profile, high-impact activities such as multinational transits of the Taiwan Straits, vice the single transit that they're doing now, and or conducting collaborative operations through contested waters like the East and the South China Sea. These rotations would allow for coordinated activities to develop interoperability with littoral states, provide essential capacity building to those partner navies in the region. Such actions contribute directly to regional stability, ensure that the burden of maintaining the rules-based order is shared and visible, reducing the reliance on any single power, especially with the United States commitment growing wobbly under the current administration. But 4 centuries of European maritime history also point to one overriding strategic lesson: global engagement is discretionary, Atlantic security for the Europeans is essential. Thus, Europe today faces a dual horizon. The near horizon, the Atlantic, the Arctic approaches, and the Mediterranean, where European security is decided. And the far horizon, which in our case here is the Indo-Pacific, where Europe contributes to global order. The challenge is not to choose one horizon over the other, but to understand their relationship. The far horizon becomes reachable only when the near horizon is secure. Again, for this Canadian, this logic aligns perfectly with Canada's national interest. Europe cannot afford to ignore a disturbing geopolitical reality. The challenge posed by China's coercive behavior in the Indo-Pacific is too much of a threat to global maritime stability and trade security to be dismissed. Engagement with those being bullied in the region is strategically necessary to uphold the very norms that underpin North American and European wealth. So, as a Pacific nation, Canada would certainly benefit, or certainly benefits, when Europe is active globally, including in the Indo-Pacific, as this spreads the stability burden. Crucially, however, we, Canada, also depend fundamentally on strong European naval forces safeguarding the Atlantic. Our own strategic fleet priorities, our vital trade routes, and the security of our eastern approaches are intrinsically linked to Europe's ability to defend its maritime front. This interdependence is especially critical in these challenging times when trade relationships with the United States heighten the imperative for Canada and its European allies to reinforce the collective security architecture within NATO. If Europe anchors its global ambitions in a reinforced Atlantic foundation, it can project with confidence. If it does not, it risks repeating an old historical pattern, overstretched at the periphery, vulnerability at the core. This history is not destiny, but it is a guide, and its lesson could not be clearer. Europe's global future begins with this Atlantic present. This concludes my presentation, and I look forward to the question period. And once again, I thank the organizers for having me. And if I may suggest, if you're looking for some light readings for Christmas or gifts and such things for the holiday period, please take those potential readings in consideration. Merci beaucoup.